From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome again to another episode of The Sculptor's Funeral. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and an educator living and working in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. So, last week, the discussion was on Luca della Robbia, the Renaissance sculptor who turned his hand to producing glazed ceramic statues and reliefs. And personally, one of the more interesting things that came to my attention when researching that podcast was the strange fact that Luca della Robbia was pretty much the first sculptor of the Western figurative tradition to devote himself to terracotta sculpture. On the face of it, one would think that the cheapest, most plentiful, and most easily manipulated material, clay, would be found in abundance in the work of the early Renaissance. But no, it's marble and even bronze, which dominate even in smaller decorative work. Now, I offered a few reasons as to why this might be so. There's the relative fragility of terracotta being one. But the theory that interests me the most is the idea that clay modeling, as a process for sculpture, came late in the game to the realm of figurative sculpture, right? Using clay models that would then be copied into marble sculpture, that wasn't adopted until the 1410s by marble carvers, right? Only a few decades before Luca della Robbia hits the scene. And before then, clay was largely the province of potters and brickmakers, not sculptors, unless the work was minor and decorative, like, floral patterns or architectural elements. But certainly it was very rarely found in the hands of figurative sculptors. Well, anyway, this got me thinking about my own, or I should say our own, time and place. And, the work I produce and the work I see done by other sculptors, as well as what's taught in schools and ateliers. And speaking very generally, I see kind of the same, I don't know if attitude is the right word, maybe perspective. I see the same sort of perspective towards clay as a final medium for sculpture. Now, clay modeling is probably the most fundamental process for producing figurative sculpture, but nowadays it's almost exclusively done as a preparation for other media, mostly bronze. And if the clay isn't immediately destined for bronze, it's being cast into plaster, right? It's uncommon to meet a figurative sculptor who fires work into terracotta, either as a preservation of the initial modeling or as a finished final medium. Now, there are lots of pros and cons in the argument of casting versus firing, of course. Casting gives you more than one copy, whereas firing, you just get the one piece. The original is the only thing you get, and if you want more than one, then you have to make a mold. And then there's the limitations of having to work without an armature for models meant to be fired, right? That's a big reason, I think, that figurative sculptors stay away from terracotta. Also, it takes time. It takes sometimes weeks for the clay to dry out sufficiently in order to fire it, whereas you can make a mold in just a few days' time. And then you need to take the work to a kiln, or you have to buy your own kiln, and they're expensive. And even then, there's the chance that the work may blow up in the kiln, or that the raw clay model could get damaged when you try to transport the piece to the kiln. All this is true. And on the other hand, terracotta is more durable and a more pleasing medium, I would say, than plaster. It's much less expensive and easier to fire something into terracotta than to make a mold. And if you're in doubt as to whether you want more than one copy of your model, well, terracotta is definitely the way to go, because you can always make a mold, as I mentioned, from the terracotta later, if you want another copy. But anyway, I'm not here to argue that people should be firing into terracotta more. Do what you want. But what I do want to address is a few concerns that seem to keep sculptors away from terracotta. The fact is that there are ways to address most of these concerns and overcome most limitations that firing clay might impose. So if you don't know much about terracotta, well, today is your lucky day. We're going to talk about all the things you can do to ensure success in terracotta sculpture. And not just how to model for firing, but the reasons why behind the how. Now, it seems whenever the topic of terracotta comes up amongst sculptors, inevitably one hears the statement, Well, I tried to do terracotta once, but it blew up in the kiln. What a terrible experience to go through, right? Putting all that time and effort into a sculpture, taking care to hollow and to dry the work thoroughly, only to lose it completely in a process over which the sculptor seems to have no control. Now, if that is a sculptor's first experience with firing, little wonder they might never attempt to do it a second time. So the first thing to understand about terracotta sculpture is the ceramic process itself, the firing itself. Knowing about firing is key to a sculptor taking control of the production of terracotta. And all that's really needed is an understanding of the clay, an understanding of what firing is and what firing clay does. And once you have that understanding, you will rarely, if ever, lose another piece in the kiln. So let's jump right into it. I'm not going to talk too much about what clay is. I did a whole episode on that last year. So if you want more background information on that sticky lump of stuff you're trying to make look like a portrait of your grandfather, I refer you to that episode. It's episode number 3. But for now, it's enough to know that clay is an inorganic compound of minerals held together by various types of bonds, right? And some of these bonds utilize water, both in a mechanical and a molecular bond, right? So molecular bond is when they bond to other molecules, and mechanical bonds would be things like suction, right? And so the first thing to understand about firing is that cooking a piece of clay in a kiln is not unlike cooking a meal, right? Every cook has their own recipe, and cooking different things requires different methods. So depending on what forms you are firing in a kiln and what your particular clay is actually made of and what you want the results to be, you're going to use different temperatures, you're going to arrive at these temperatures at different speeds, and you might even use different types of kilns, all right? So there isn't a sort of one-size-fits-all recipe for firing. You fire pots and vases that are thrown on a potter's wheel very differently than you would fire a hand-built sculpture. And this, in fact, is probably the number one reason why sculptures explode in the kiln. Because successful potters and ceramicists, they have their own formulas that are very successful for what they're doing, but if they apply their baking formula to a clay form of a different type, like a nice, thick, hand-built sculpture, disaster is usually the result. So, what exactly goes on inside a kiln? What happens when you heat clay to 1,000 degrees Celsius? Well, let's take a lump of clay, stick it in a kiln, and see what happens. So starting off with the kiln off at room temperature, 20 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the only thing your clay is going to do when the kiln is off is slowly dry out, right? Water evaporates off the surface of your clay, just as anything that you leave lying around wet will dry out, whether it's your bath towel or your gym socks or your clay. They all release moisture into the air, but only to a certain point, right? The clay will never dry out to a point less humid than the atmosphere around it. So if your studio has 70% humidity, that means your clay is going to retain a similar proportion of humidity, right? So it can never truly dry out, just air drying. And if you know one thing about firing ceramics, you probably know that humidity, aka water, is bad, bad, bad when it's inside your clay. Because after a certain temperature, about 100 degrees Celsius to be exact, water boils. And water expands into vapor when it boils. And if that water expanding into vapor is still in your lump of clay, then that expanding vapor might just blow a hole through your clay. Now, this doesn't always happen if there is moisture in clay, right? Clay is very, very porous, which is why it dries out so easily. And if the water is trapped fairly near the surface of the clay, well, the vapor might just be able to squeeze out in between the clay particles without blowing a hole in your sculpture. But why take that chance, right? So the best thing to do is to make sure your clay is completely dry before taking the temperature of the kiln past the boiling point of water. So the first thing you do in firing a kiln is you run it at a temperature a little bit below the boiling point of water just for a few hours to drive off the residual humidity of your air-dried clay. And this first stage of firing is known as either smoking or candling. So a rule of thumb is that you should smoke your kiln for about 2 hours per inch of thickness of whatever you're firing, right? And this is one of the several reasons sculptors hollow their work out, so that moisture from within the clay can reach the surface to escape. It doesn't necessarily have to be thin, but it helps in the drawing process. So if the thickest section of your work is, say, 2 inches thick, then you need to plan on smoking or candling your kiln for 4 hours at the minimum. A common practice for potters is just to leave the kiln at a candling or smoking temperature overnight. And when you smoke the kiln, you leave the vents open so that the moisture can escape the kiln. Most kilns have little holes in them known as vents. Vents are used in several ways. You can use them like peepholes to see what's happening inside the kiln without having to actually open the kiln door. But when we candle a kiln, we need to leave those vents open to check the progress of the candling and also to let the water vapor escape the kiln. And what you can do to check the progress is you take a mirror and you hold it just above one of the vents during the candling process. And if the mirror fogs up, well, that means you're still burning off atmospheric moisture in your clay. So what you want is a completely dry heat coming out of those vents, and you can tell using a mirror. Not a whiff of vapor on the mirror is what you want. Now, your final stage of smoking might include ramping the temperature up to just past the boiling point at around 120 degrees Celsius or 250 degrees Fahrenheit or thereabouts. This is to ensure that even deep within inside the clay sculpture, every part is hot enough to boil out the water. Now, I want to mention at this point that there are actually two types of moisture present in the clay, and smoking or candling gets rid of only one type of moisture, which is the atmospheric moisture. There still is water present in the clay even after candling, and that water is molecularly bound up into the crystalline structure of the clay, and it just won't evaporate off, right? What we need to do is to take the temperature much higher in order to break those molecular bonds and get that second batch of water to escape. And so let's take the temperature higher. So from the boiling point, we're going to go up to about 350 degrees Celsius, or that's 662 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Now this next stage, ramping up from boiling point to 350 degrees Celsius, is called the decomposition stage. And this is where any organic components are broken down. Now they're not burned off yet, they're just broken down a bit. Organic compounds in the clay can include anything from the oil off of your hands that gets absorbed into the clay, or tiny bits of vegetable matter, like maybe from a sponge that you used, or cloth that you used to keep the sculpture wet, or just tiny little bits of organic stuff that was always present in the clay, like bacteria. Let's say you have a scrap of paper sort of accidentally lodged in your clay. It's at this stage that paper will char or maybe even catch fire, but it doesn't vaporize, right? The ash and the carbon left from that paper, it's still going to be there at the decomposition stage. So if you are sure that you have candled your work sufficiently, you can take the kiln up to 350 degrees Celsius fairly quickly, as the chemical processes happening at this stage inside the clay, they won't disturb the clay too much. The work will naturally expand a bit as it gets hotter. So the raising of the temperature, as always, needs to be somewhat gradual so that every part of your work expands at the same rate, right? You want everything to get the same temperature at the same time so it has the same rate of expansion throughout your sculpture. And here we have the second reason why you hollow out your work, right? The important thing about hollowing out the work isn't to make it thin necessarily, but to make the work a uniform thickness or thinness. Thicker parts of a sculpture will heat and cool more slowly than thinner parts. So if you have a thin part right next to a thick part in your sculpture, the heat differential, as these two adjacent pieces of clay expand and contract at different rates, that's what's going to make your sculpture warp or even crack or even break. So we're up to 350 degrees now, and has the clay actually changed yet? Well, a few processes are happening, like quartz inversion, which is where the quartz present in the clay turns from sort of one structure, one type of quartz to another type of quartz. But that actually reverses itself once the clay cools down again, so it's a temporary change in the clay. Now, mostly the decomposition stage is kind of just preparing everything in the clay for what happens at higher temperatures. Getting from boiling point through the decomposition stage, you don't have to worry about anything except how fast you raise the temperature. And this speed, or degrees per hour, is called the ramp, right? When you have a firing rate, like how many degrees you take up per hour, potters, ceramicists call that the ramp. So your ramp for this stage should be about 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 90 degrees Celsius per hour, right? So going at that rate, we arrive in just a few hours' time at the third stage, past 350 degrees. And that stage is called the stage of ceramic change. And it's at this stage that our lump of clay goes past the point of no return. Mainly what happens is the molecular water particles that are sort of attached to the crystalline structure, they detach. So it's sort of like a second candling. Now, there's not much danger that this molecular water vapor will rupture your clay because it's a relatively small component compared to the atmospheric moisture. But the interesting thing is that because you're losing a component of the molecular structure of the clay, your clay actually shrinks at this stage instead of expanding. Even though it's getting hotter, it gets a little smaller because you're losing a component of the structure of the clay, which was the molecular water. So this process of ceramic action happens between the temperature ranges of 350 degrees Celsius all the way up to about 700 degrees Celsius, or from 650 to 1,290 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot stuff. So you want your ramp to be somewhere in the range of 180 degrees Celsius per hour, or about 300 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. But as with every stage, what type of clay and how thick the clay is will affect your ramp. And then, ramping up past the temperature of 700 degrees Celsius, or 1290 Fahrenheit, we come to the oxidation stage, also known as the burnout stage. And this is where those organic compounds that you decomposed in the decomposition stage, that's when they go up in smoke, right? So let's say you had that little piece of paper that sort of burnt and charred and left a little black smudge in your clay. Well, all the carbon and sulfur present in that clay, any bits of paper or cloth or bugs or whatever it is, it vaporizes. The carbon, that little smudge, combines with oxygen and creates all sorts of wonderful gases like carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide and other stuff you don't want to breathe a lot of. So that's why kilns need to be ventilated. Also, these gases need to escape the kiln, just like the water vapor did. So all the way up to this stage, if the kiln is not equipped with a special exhaust vent, then you need to leave some of your little peephole vents open. And now, at this stage, at the oxidation stage, this is where things are getting critical in terms of temperature. After the candling, we've been increasing the temperature fairly constantly, right? Even though we've been going at slightly different speeds, the temperature is just constantly and slowly climbed, right? But you don't want to rush through the oxidation stage. You need to make sure that all the carbon and all the sulfur and whatever else you can vaporize out of the clay is gone completely. So what you do normally is you stop the ramp. That is, you leave the temperature at a steady rate and not increase it past the oxidation temperature for a little while, right? Maybe an hour, maybe 3. A steady temperature like this is called a soak, right? You're soaking the ceramics in a heat bath for a while in order to get all parts of the ceramic up to the same temperature. And it also gives enough time for all the chemical magic to happen, like oxidation of all the carbon, right? You need to let it, soak at a certain temperature for a while. And you soak the kiln at around 800 degrees Celsius, or 1,472 degrees Fahrenheit. And here's why it's important to soak at 800 degrees until all the carbon is gone, because after 800 degrees, something starts to happen in the clay called sintering. Sintering is when you have two clay particles that touch each other, right? And of course, these these clay particles at 800 degrees are very, very hot. And the points of contact between these particles are so hot that they sort of fuse together with each other. And once that happens, your clay is no longer clay, but a material that we call bisque, or sometimes biscuit, right? And here's the thing. When your clay particles sinter and, fuse together at contact points, that sintering process kind of closes off little avenues of escape in between the clay particles for things like the gases created at the oxidation stage, right? So sintering the clay seals the clay somewhat. So you want all the oxidation to happen before sintering starts. And that's why you soak it at 800 degrees until you're sure the oxidation is done. Then you take the temperature higher and your clay sinters and turns into bisque. So this sintering, this fusing of clay particles, that's not the same thing as vitrification, right? You've probably heard that term. Vitrification, the root word, not exactly sure, but in Italian it's vetro, which means glass, right? So you're turning, vitrification is to turn something into glass. Now, vitrification is a separate process from sintering, but they do start to happen right around the same time. So after that magic 800 degrees Celsius mark, some of the silica in the clay starts to melt into glass. Now remember, clay is mostly a compound called alumina silicate, right? So there's plenty of silica present in clay. It's not the only thing in clay, of course, but there's a lot of it in there. And so this melted silica, this melted glass, flows around the remaining clay particles, sort of locking them together. And of course, they're already held into place because of the sintering. And so this melted glass sort of fills in all the little tiny spaces in between the clay particles to create a much more non-porous material. And if you were to, at this point, look into one of your vents that you've left open in the kiln, while your kiln was at about 800 degrees, you would see that your clay sculpture is now starting to glow a dull red. And as the temperature is ramped up from this point to its final temperature, the color of the glow from your clay changes, right? You'll see it go to cherry red, and then bright red, and then red orange, and orange yellow, and so on, all the way up to a final brilliant white that is achieved around the temperature of 1,400 degrees Celsius, or 2,550 degrees Fahrenheit. But wait, you most likely do not need to fire your work to that sort of high temperature. In fact, the kind of clay you are using would probably melt into a puddle of glass at that temperature. It is vital to know the firing temperature of the particular clay you are using, as different clays are made of different minerals, which make them more or less capable of withstanding high temperatures. So earthenware, for example, fires at one temperature, and then stoneware is going to fire at a different temperature, and things like porcelain fire at a much higher temperature. Remember, vitrification is the act of melting certain components in your clay, and if you take the temperature too high, you melt too much of your clay, and then the work literally starts to slump over and melt, and little bits will drop off, and all sorts of bad things. High-fired clays, like porcelains, they turn a lot more glassy, right? But they're also made up of things that won't melt, right, in order to retain the structure of the form. Whereas low-fire clays, like earthenware, they don't have the same components that allow them to retain that structure at a higher point. So most of the ceramic clay that sculptors use is a low-fire clay. But again, never assume that one clay fires like another. So when you buy your ceramic clay, you need to know what temperature it gets fired to. And then when you take your work to a kiln, you need to let them know that temperature as well. They might just assume it's like a clay that they use, and it could be a completely different clay. So once you reach your final temperature, whatever that might be, you are not done yet, because the cooling of the kiln is just as important as the heating. In fact, it's in the cooling process of the kiln that pieces tend to break most often, by impatient potters hurrying up the cooling process by opening the kiln while it's still too hot, or by just turning the kiln off at a high temperature and allowing it to cool on its own, which sometimes can cool too quickly. So the best thing is to have a controlled cooling, right, where you're still actually adding heat or fuel to the kiln, slowing down the cooling rate. Now, I've read that a good rule of thumb is somewhere between 125 and 175 degrees Fahrenheit per hour, or that's also 65 degrees Celsius per hour of cooling. And once it gets down to just a few hundred degrees, you can then shut the kiln off and let it cool down to room temperature on its own. So note that the cooling period, because of this slowed, controlled cooling, can take the better part of a day, or, even an entire day, up to 20 hours, 25 hours, just to cool it. And you don't want to rush it. As your clay cools, it shrinks, and if you cool it too fast, it's going to shrink too fast, and that's where you get a crack. Even at temperatures less than 500 degrees Celsius, cracks can still happen. So take it slow. So that's the process of firing in a nutshell. And now all you have to do is open the kiln and take out your brand new piece of terracotta sculpture. Of course, it's going to be different for everyone, as I mentioned. Every cook's got their own recipe. And when using an unfamiliar kiln, or working with someone you haven't worked with before, or working with a clay you haven't worked with before, do a test piece, right? So you know what you're in for. Now, just to run it down quickly once again, you can think of the stages as the candling or smoking stage, the decomposition stage, the ceramic stage, the soak, and then vitrification, and then the cool down. And if you Google the phrase kiln firing chart, you're going to find tons and tons of material and charts and guidelines to follow for different clays and different types of kilns. And these charts will give probably a fuller and more clear explanation of the process than I've just done. Now, obviously, if you're buying your own kiln, you're going to learn a lot from other sources than this podcast. And if you're taking your work to someone else to fire, they probably are going to know a lot about what they're doing as well, hopefully. And now that we know the stages of firing, we get a better idea of why we do the things we do when modeling clay meant to be fired, the purpose of hollowing, and why we don't use armatures. But there's a lot more to modeling figures for terracotta than just the hollowing out, right? Sculptors have developed lots of tricks and methods for overcoming all the limitations that ceramic figures seem to impose, like not working with armatures. And I'm going to go over some of the best of these tricks and tips when the Sculptor's Funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners. The Sculptor's Funeral is made possible by your generous donations, as well as by our sponsor, Blick Art Supplies. That's right, friends. Blick Art Supplies, the largest and oldest provider of art supplies in the United States, shipping their quality wares around the world. Their superior customer service, extensive selection, and competitive prices make them the choice for professional and amateur artists, art educators, architects, designers, students, and hobbyists. Virtually anyone requiring quality art materials for work or for pleasure. And seriously, there isn't another art supplier on the web with as many supplies and materials specifically for sculptors than Blick. It's really huge. They have over 70,000 products for artists of all types. You can get everything you need, from dozens of different clays and plasters to fine Italian marble carving tools, clay modeling tools, specialty casting mediums, body casting supplies, turntables, armatures, books on sculpture, you name it. If you need it for sculpture, they got it. And shipping is free in the U.S. for most items if your order is over $100. But Blick is not merely a place to buy stuff. Their sales staff and product information specialists are trained to hunt down answers to your tough questions regarding materials, techniques, and safety. Hundreds of Blick videos are also available at dickblick.com and on YouTube, including video lesson plans for teachers and product demonstrations for artists. And best of all, by buying your art supplies from Blick, you contribute directly to the support of the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. All you need to do is this. Go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and click on any of the banner links that you see there. And that will take you right to the Blick website where you can buy whatever you need. It's that simple. Just remember that you need to click through a link on thesculptorsfuneral.com first so that Blick knows I sent you. So the next time you stock up on armature wire, mold rubber, modeling tools, and plastilina, do it in a way that supports the only podcast out there devoted to the global community of figurative sculptures. Go to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on Blick and support the show. Thanks. All right. Now let's discuss a little bit these tips and tricks that clay modelers use to create clay work suitable for firing. Now that we know what goes on in the firing process, we know that we have to make our clay models with a uniform thickness. We also know that we can't really have a typical metal armature inside of a work that we're going to fire, right? Because in addition to what goes on in the firing process, just having the clay model air dry includes a lot of shrinkage. And of course, if the armature doesn't shrink when the clay shrinks, you're going to have the work crack. And so the solution to both of these issues is to hollow out the clay model, right? Hollowing out not only gives you the chance to remove the armature, but also allows you to scrape down the inside of the figure or the bust, whatever it is, until your work is more or less a uniform thickness. So hollowing out a portrait bust is not really a problem, right? Even if you do a portrait bust on an armature. All you need to do is let the clay dry out to a certain point, which is sometimes called leather hard stage. That's where the clay is fairly dry and doesn't take your fingerprints. It's not really workable clay anymore. But at the same time, it's not so dry that it can't maybe take the impression of your fingernail, right? So you let it dry out to that leather hardness. Then you slice the work in half, usually behind the ears of the bust. You use your cheese wire for that. And it doesn't have to be in half exactly. All you need to do is remove a large enough portion of the back of the head that will allow the armature to get free of the work once you have done a little bit of excavation. So you get out your loop tool and you start to dig. And once both halves are free of the armature and sufficiently hollowed, then you can join those two pieces back together by lightly scoring the edges of the join with a clay tool, dabbing a little bit of slip on the scored edge, and then pressing firmly those two halves back into place. And then you clean up the seam. Slip, by the way, if you don't know, it's just a mixture of clay and water. Clay that's so water saturated that you can apply it with a brush. Not too watery, but not too thick either. So what about hollowing out a figure? Well, if you're using a standard figure armature, one with little metal rods running through down to the ankles and to the wrists of your figure, well, you're going to have a hard time getting it out of the clay without cutting up your figure into 100 different pieces. But there are ways around that, though. If it's not a standing pose, it's possible to model up to a half-life-size seated figure or reclining figure without an armature. And if the figure is to be a standing pose, well, you can add some sort of third leg to the pose for support, whether that's drapery or a tree stump like Michelangelo uses for the David, or any other physical mass that attaches the base to the figure above the ankles or higher, lending stability to the work. Another way is to create an exterior armature that can be eventually removed from the clay when the clay is firm enough to support itself. Exterior armatures can be anything from masses of clay supporting the figure from below or behind to wooden or metal rods acting as splints or crutches to the limbs of your figure. And here's a pro tip for using exterior armature supports. Do not embed them into your figure. For instance, if you want to use a metal rod to support an upright head, right, what you don't do is stick the rod through the top of the head, all the way down into the neck. That'll work, of course. That'll keep your head from falling off, but the idea, of course, is to eventually remove the rod when the clay is firm enough to support itself. And the only way the clay becomes firm enough to support itself is by drying out, and when clay dries, it shrinks. This means your clay head will shrink around your metal support rod, and it's going to grab it firmly. And then when the time comes for removing that rod, you're going to find it difficult to remove it without pulling the head off with it. So what you do is you just partially embed your support into the side or the back of the head or whatever limb you're trying to support, and you leave the entire length of your rod partially visible. Right? Clay should not enclose the rod, but rather the rod just lies sort of partly embedded into the surface of the clay. And that way you can pry the rod away from the figure when the time comes without having to draw it out of the depths of the figure and possibly damage it. Now I'm gonna put my money where my mouth is here. I've got a few images on the image gallery for this episode that I've taken over the years in my studio of my own works and some of my students' works that will illustrate these various processes. So if you go on over to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on the link for the image gallery for this episode, which is episode number 45, you will see pictures of students hollowing out their heads, hollowing out seated figures, as well as other pics which show a few processes I haven't yet talked about. So back to modeling figures without armatures. One way that I've found to be very successful is to first model an armature in clay. What I have my students do is on the first day of a pose, we build kind of a thin version of the pose in clay. And we'll use little metal rods of armature wire to make exterior supports for these flimsy little thin limbs. And then we let the work dry overnight. So the next morning, these thin little figures are now stiff enough that we can remove the metal supports, and we can even add more clay on top of it. Effectively, we've sculpted an armature in clay, allowed it to harden, and then we bulk up the volume of the figure only when that interior portion can support it. When doing this, it's especially important that you don't try to hit the full volumes of the work on the first day, especially in the head. What I have my students do is just sort of model a neck, right? A nice thin neck, but a neck that extends well into the space where the head will eventually be, like a really, really long, almost giraffe neck. And once that skinny clay neck is firm enough, then you can add the volume of the head later without too much fear of it falling off. Now, if you try this technique, one more tip I want to mention is that if you need to change the pose of the figure after you've made your clay armature, don't try to move the clay around. Don't bend an arm over or move a leg over. You want to wiggle the clay around as little as possible, because that's only going to weaken the structure of the clay. What you need to do, for instance, if you want to move a leg over to one side, is you add the clay which shows the new position of the leg, right? Which will mean that, suddenly your leg is going to look, 3 times as thick as it should be. And then when that has set up, only then do you remove the clay that represents the old position of the leg, right? So the key is that when you're working the figure, you're not moving anything, you're adding and subtracting as opposed to moving clay. So with a clay figure, how much do you actually need to hollow? Well, it's going to depend on the size of the work to some extent, but I would say that anything under about a third life size, it doesn't need much hollowing at all. It's standard to hollow out the base of any figure to some extent, just to remove a little bit of weight. And if you can dig up from the bottom of the base into the hips or legs of a seated figure, then yeah, go for it. At the image gallery, you will see a student in the process of hollowing out a seated figure at 40% life size. And in addition to hollowing out from the base and into the seat that the figure is seated on, he's sort of seated on sort of a tree stump sort of form, you can see in the picture that the student has also cut a window out of the back of the figure, right? She's basically sliced off the back third of the torso. And through this gap, she can then hollow out the figure up into the shoulders and down into the hips, and then put that part of the torso that she cut off back on with a little slip. Now, we did this during a 20-minute model break, and we did it on the next to the last day of using the model, so that any modeling that was obscured by this operation could be patched up using the live model. So you can cut windows like this into any part of the figure that you want to hollow. You can cut a window into the thigh, into the head, anywhere. And it makes hollowing a figure fairly simple. But the one thing you have to remember is that when you hollow out an area, there must be a path for the air in the cavity you've created to escape. For instance, if you just cut off the top of a head of a figure and then hollow that head out and then stick the top of the head back on, you need to make sure that you've extended that cavity you've made down into the neck, down into the torso, down into the hips, and right out the base, all right? Finally reaching the exterior of the model. You need a path for the air to escape the sculpture. And if you don't, what you have essentially done is created an enclosed cavity in the head where moisture can easily collect and where moisture can only escape with great difficulty. And then if you heat the work in a kiln a little too quickly, the gases or vapors in that enclosed hollow head will turn that head into a grenade. You don't want that. All the empty spaces in a model must have an unimpeded path out. It doesn't have to be a big path, but it does have to be there. All right, you say, modeling clay for firing is all well and good for the occasional bust and small clay figures in a limited variety of poses. But why should you be limited by your material, right? I mean, if I use an armature and cast in plaster or bronze, I can make virtually anything I want at any scale and in any pose, standing, seated, balanced on one foot. It doesn't matter, right? Life-sized, over life-sized. It doesn't matter if you're casting, if you're making a mold. But you can't do all that if you're firing, right? Well, I know of over 8,000 terracotta warriors in China that would disagree with you. And I am referring, of course, to the astounding collection of life-sized figures, both of men and of life-sized terracotta horses, known commonly as the Terracotta Army. The Terracotta Army is part of a huge necropolis in China, which honors and protects the immortal soul of China's first emperor Qin Shi Huang, dating back to the 3rd century BC, making these terracottas 2,200 years old. And with these figures, we see all the excuses we have for not working in terracotta fall away. Making up this terracotta army are crouching as well as standing soldiers and musicians and officials and acrobats and over 500 horses. And on top of that, they are all unique, not duplicates. Again, these figures were life-sized, including the horses, and made in hollow terracotta. Now, it's hard enough to make a horse in a plaster cast reinforced with a steel skeleton, and here we have it in terracotta. Now, if you can make a life-size horse in terracotta, you know you can pretty much make anything you want in terracotta. So what's the secret? I mean, if it's such a struggle just to model a seated, small-scale terracotta without an armature, then how were all these large standing figures done? Well, the answer is simple. They were made from press molds. A press mold is a simple mold made just in plaster, no silicon rubber or any other flexible material, just plaster. And how it's done is the original clay is covered in plaster, but done so in sections, each of which can be removed with minimal damage to your clay original. And that means in every place in which your model might have an undercut, a new plaster mold section is made to eliminate that undercut. Now, if you don't know what an undercut is, imagine taking your clenched fist and sticking it into a bucket of fresh plaster. Now, once that plaster sets and turns hard, you won't be able to get your fist out of the bucket, right? Because the ball of your fist is larger than the circumference of your wrist, right? You're stuck. But if you were to first take your fist and cover just one side of it with plaster, and then do the other side with more plaster, basically making a two-part mold, well, you can then remove the two halves from your fist without the loss of your hand, right? These two parts eliminated the undercut, which was present in the one-part mold you made in the bucket of plaster, right? So that's an undercut. Anytime your original gets stuck in the mold, it's stuck because of an undercut. And so that's all a press mold is that idea, you know? And they can be simple, like just a simple two-part mold, or they can be quite complex, like when you're doing a figure or a horse. Press molds can become sort of like three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles with lots of different pieces all locking into their neighbors. And if you've heard or seen of a similar type of mold referred to as a piece mold, well, they're essentially the same thing. What makes a piece mold a press mold is in how you use it. So to use your press mold, what you do is you take each mold piece that you've made, each little plaster section, one by one, you press a layer of nice, fresh, soft clay onto the surface of the mold, right? And you don't want to use any release agent, no oil or soap. In fact, sealing the plaster mold would actually be a bad thing because you want the mold to wick moisture away from the clay. So you start by, covering the interior of all these mold pieces with clay, and then you join each mold piece with its neighbor, building up your three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle as you go, making sure that all the edges of your layers of clay join nicely and firmly with their neighbors, using a little slip, a little bit of scoring. And once it's all together, once you've put your mold back together completely with a layer of clay on the inside, you give the mold some time, maybe a few days. And during that time, the thirsty plaster mold wicks away some of the humidity of the clay, and when that clay is nice and firm and relatively dry, you can remove the press mold piece by piece, and voila, you now have a hollow clay cast of your original clay model. Go to the image gallery and you can see a YouTube video made by a small company that makes reproductions of the famous Terracotta warriors. And they use the same techniques which were used to create the original ones 2,000 years ago. You'll see examples of a small press mold being used, a very simple 2-piece press mold to make a miniature terracotta warrior. But you'll also see a section of a life-size terracotta warrior that was produced from a mold. And I've also got a few pictures of some press molds that I've made, too. Now, the advantages to using a press mold to make terracotta sculpture are many. For one thing, you can model your original clay model just like you would if you were going to cast it, right? You can use an armature, even you can use oil-based clay, it doesn't matter, because just like when making any other type of mold, the original clay model won't be a part of the final work, right? Another advantage to casting in clay is that when you cast your work in clay and then take it out of the mold, you have an opportunity to work that clay, right? It's just clay. So not only can you touch up the seams and, take care of all the little casting imperfections that happen, but you can add to or subtract to or change the work as easily as you could with your clay original, because again, it's just clay. And because the clay is lightweight and hollow, as well as strong, because you want to let it dry out before taking it out of the mold, you can get the figures to stand up without having to have a third leg. Now, if you have been warned away from trying to make a piece mold because they're so complex and so tricky and so unforgiving, you should know that using a piece mold to cast in clay, it's a lot less tricky than if you were using it to make a plaster cast, right? For instance, let's say you make a mistake in your piece mold and you leave an undercut in your mold, right? Now, if you are using that mold to make a plaster cast, that's going to spell big trouble. But because you're casting in clay, you get a break. Because let's say you have an undercut and you lose, a chin or a finger or whatever. Well, it's just clay, right? So you can model a new clay chin onto your clay cast. And for larger mistakes, let's say you lose, half a face or, a shoulder. Well, you can just take some clay and press it into your mold piece, just the specific section that was lost, and then you basically create a replacement part that you can then attach to your damaged figure to repair it, right? So let's say you screw up the head entirely, but the rest of the figure is great. We'll just recast the head and then attach it, scoring, slipping. It's just clay. Secondly, if your undercut in your mold is minor, it might not even be a problem at all, because the longer you leave your clay cast inside the mold, the drier it gets, and of course clay shrinks when it dries. So your cast in clay will be a little smaller than the mold, which will allow you to remove the mold even on a slightly undercut piece. And finally, one thing you can do to minimize the complexity of the mold in the first place is to leave out a lot of the detail in your original clay, like hair or drapery or other details that add a lot of undercuts. Just leave the figure fairly simple, right? And that's going to make your mold easier and simpler to make. And then after you make the clay cast, you can then add the hair or the drapery or whatever details to the clay cast once it's out of the mold. Once again, at the image gallery, you're going to find a bunch of pictures of some press molds I've made and used, as well as some of the work that has come out of these molds. You'll see how I've changed the work. I've cast one figure several times, and I've done very, very different things with each different figure. Added drapery to a nude study, or changed the base, all sorts of different things. So finally, I want to mention scale. How big can you go in terracotta? Well, you can go as big as you want. Just like with making molds for bronze casting, you're going to cast things in sections if they're large scale, right? Once your cast sections are out of the press molds, you can join them just like you would join any two clay pieces, right? So let's say you're doing a life-size figure. Well, you can make the head in one mold section. You can make the torso in one or two sections, and the limbs and everything. And then when the pieces come out of the molds, then you put it together and you reassemble your life-size figure. But wait, you say, that's all well and good to make a life-sized hollow clay, but now you need to find a kiln big enough to fire a life-sized clay. Well, yeah, there's that. Kilns on that scale are rare, although industrial kilns are out there. You can find big kilns. But a more plausible method might be to assemble your clay sections not before you fire, but after you fire, right? So you cast it all in sections, you let them dry out, you cook them, and then you assemble the finished terracotta. So you can make a life-size figure in several parts and just cement them together after firing. And if you're clever with where you make your mold sections, you can hide those seams and joins pretty well. There's also the option of not permanently attaching your pieces, but you can make Roman joins and have a figure that you can assemble and disassemble multiple times, right? And that might be a big advantage if you want to do a large-scale work that you need to move from exhibition to exhibition. So with the right planning and the right construction, you can have a figure which you can assemble on site and disassemble afterwards. Lots of possibilities here. It takes a little practice, but the rewards of creating terracotta sculptures are great. With terracotta sculpture made from press molds, a sculptor gains the ability to produce large-scale sculpture in a permanent, weatherproof medium for just a few $100s, and using the most elemental of materials: plaster, clay, and fire. So that's a basic overview of the possibilities of terracotta for us figurative sculptors. I hope it encourages a few of you to give it a try, especially using piece molds and press molds, which I think are just, they're magical. I love them. As always, you can subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile or iTunes, or subscribe from any service from which you get your podcasts and receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device every week. And if you do go to iTunes, give the podcast a rating. It really helps the show's visibility, and I want every sculptor in the world to listen to my show. So check out the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, where you can stream the complete archives of the show. You can check out the image galleries for this and for each episode. And if you happen to be in the market for some art supplies, make sure you click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies. Doing so supports the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.